Welcome on this very cold day for what promises to be a fascinating talk by our guest speaker, Neringa Klumbute. My name is Christina Fehérváry. I'm the Director of Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and this is our every week CREASE noon lecture. We're very fortunate today to have with us Neringa, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Miami University in Ohio. She's also a member of the Having First Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies and Associate Faculty at the Food Studies Institute at Miami University. She has also been editor for a while of the journal Perspectives on Europe, which is a journal affiliated with the Council of European Studies. Neringa has published on a wide variety of things. She's specializes in late Soviet era, but also in contemporary issues. One of her more fascinating titles is an analysis of nationalism, contemporary nationalism in Lithuania, seen through the lens of sausages, specifically looking at the way Lithuanians reject Euro sausages and choose Soviet sausages, even though, as you probably know, Lithuania was not especially happy to be part of the Soviet sphere. So I'm taking a look at this kind of contradiction and trying to make sense of it through prosaic consumption and eating habits. Today she's going to give a talk that's related to her upcoming manuscript. She first I'll say she edited a book called The Intimacy, Soviet Society in the Area of Late Socialism, but her upcoming manuscript is called The Intimacy of Power, Aesthetics, Governance, and the Covert Sphere in Soviet Lithuania during the time period she's speaking about today, 1964 to 1985. The title of her talk today is Of Secrecy and Laughter, Aesthetics, Governance, and the Covert Sphere in Soviet Lithuania. So please join me in welcoming Neringa. I think you just click on this. I think on that too.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you to Christina Fehérváry for inviting me, and my colleagues for having me here, and also to the Center of Russian and I shouldn't say the name of my center, the Russian, Eastern European and Eurasian Studies, as well as the Center for European Studies. So thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. I just want to warn you ahead of time that it are not going to be very exciting jokes. So these are Soviet jokes. So so bear with me. I'll first say some introductory comments and tell you about my research, how this has started, how I got interested in Soviet jokes in Lithuania. And then I'll move to the major part of my presentation, which is about secrecy and the covert sphere in the official humor and satire journal Broom, which is called Broom. Well, I guess to this audience, I don't have to speak about the power of humor, and the last year events are kind of a testimony to that. In Soviet times, there was, of course, also a very strong power assigned to humor, and leaders from, we can go as far as Marx, right, believed that humor is very much important in shaping society. So let me cite Karl Marx first, and this is 1961, who stated that history is thorough and passes through many phases when carrying an old form to the grave. The final phase of a world historical form is its comedy. The Greek gods, already once mortally wounded tragically in Aeschylus' Prometheus Bound, had to die once more comically in the dialogues of Lysian. Why does history proceed this way? So that humanity will separate itself happily from its past. And this was kind of a spirit picked up after the Bolshevik Revolution. At an early stage of the revolution, prominent Bolshevik scholars carried out a scientific analysis into the nature of the revolutionary laugh, coming to weighty discussions, conclusions about the importance of caricature as a weapon destructive of what was valueless. And Lenin himself said that art must serve propaganda. Under Stalin, there was a development of common communist humor language that they were very much interested in coming up with. It's a new communist society, so it was supposed to have its own communist humor language. And Khrushchev claimed satire is like a sharp razor. It shows human tumors and quickly, like a good surgeon, takes them out. So I'm just traveling very fast through the history of the Soviet Union, and I'll end up, of course, in Soviet Lithuania. Jonas Bulota, who was the editor-in-chief of The Broom, also very much inherited this agenda. And he stressed that The Broom has to speak about serious things in a cheerful way. It has to laugh at various ills that hinder our march to the bright communist future. So I'm emphasizing that maybe it's not so exciting, but this was the official platform. This was very important for The Broom, and they had to follow these principles. But it was not exactly the case, and I'll tell you what The Broom was all about. Now, why Soviet humor? For me, I'm an anthropologist, and I was primarily interested in post-Soviet relations in my research. So for me, this was a way to also look at society and state relations from kind of a different angle from late socialist period and talk about society that lived under authoritarian conditions. Also, The Broom was interesting because it challenged common dichotomies and explanations and invited to search for new analytics. So doing research in Lithuania, it was not so easy to explain everything in terms of communism or nationalism or dissidence. You could see that those categories do not capture the reality that you see there. And this was part of the puzzle that I had to kind of uncover through my research. I was also intrigued that this topic allowed me kind of to touch people's intimate lives, to talk about them, about their past, their memories, how they lived, how they laughed, what they liked, what they didn't. And also, it also took me to the kind of much higher levels, which was, for example, secret police investigations or Central Committee concerns about The Broom itself. And I was also intrigued by paradoxes that I found in The Broom. So I didn't find exactly what Karl Marx anticipated or Lenin. And I will tell you about what was there. And this was a very intriguing part that I wanted to explain and to myself and, of course, to my students and kind of have a conversation about late socialism. Sorry, pressed the wrong button. Okay, this will work. So I'll shortly talk about the history of The Broom, and then I'll have to say that it actually complied to a large extent with the official agenda it had. It was a journal of communist propaganda. But my major talk will be devoted to uncovering that covert sphere and speaking about secrecies of The Broom. And then I'll bring up some conclusions about The Broom and what it tells us about late socialism. Now, this is not funny, if you wonder already. So this was the image itself. It's from 1940, but The Broom starts in 1934. In 1934, 1936, we have some journal issues coming out. At that time, Lithuania was independent. It was not a part of the Soviet Union. So they published communists, Lithuanian communists, they published it underground. And it looks like, and I don't have accurate data, it looks like they were caught and they had to flee and close the journal. Now, 1940, 1941, the journal was revived again. And in 1940, the first issue actually comes out 12 days before Lithuania becomes a member of the Soviet Union republics. And 1941, Lithuania is occupied by Nazis, and many people, including artists who were in charge of the journals, flee to Russia. So the journal is discontinued again. 1956, it's the third birth of the journal. It is resurrected, and it's supposed to serve the communist cause, to build a Soviet society in Lithuania through humor and laughter. Now, the first images, they are not necessarily funny. The broom is very different in 1956, and of course, that's the time of the thaw. It's the time of relative liberalization. So we don't see exactly the same kind of revolutionary spirit and propaganda that we see during Stalinist period, and especially in Crocodile. I'll show you what the broom was primarily all about before going into the covert sector of the broom, and I'll give you some copies. So they are 40 years old, so don't wonder that they look dusty and ugly. But artists tell me, that there were shortages of paper, and they didn't have good paper, they didn't have good color, so they were not something like amazing, I guess, 40 years ago as well. So this will give you a sense. That's the celebration of Soviet journal Crocodile. Crocodile 50 years. So this is the official broom, and some official images that were not that were expected, that were not problematic, let's say this way, and then there were others as well. So political cartoons were supposed to populate the broom. Anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, anti-nationalism, anti-religious themes were expected to be there, and here you can see some of those. Of course, this is, the critique of the United States, and you see US, every cartoon had to be labeled so it would not be ambiguous. So it had to be US, so nobody would think it's USSR or another country. But there were also a lot, and these anti-imperialist cartoons did not take a lot of the broom. The majority of cartoons, and these were 2/3 of the journal most of the time, were about everyday life issues. Now, some would say it's not political. I think it is political because it very much coincided with the official agenda of the state. They had to discipline people through their everyday life, through work collectives. There was the Communist Moral Code published in 1961. So this was kind of in compliance with the official agenda. And if we want to see, those boundaries, we can look how, for example, the West was portrayed in those humor journals across the Soviet Union and even in the Eastern Bloc. So the West was a place where crime, corruption, war efforts, all kind of negative issues were part of everyday life. While in case of the Soviet Union, humor journals, you would see those minor things like work relationships, social vices, bureaucrats, and bureaucracy. So as if, the other things did not exist there. So there were minor, small issues that have to be corrected, whether this is humor or some other initiatives outside the broom in society. Well, alcoholism, of course, was prominent, and a lot of themes about alcoholism. This is about materialism and on consumption to some extent. And here is another cartoon. The most important thing is to be on time, and then when you get inside, you just hang out. Very, I guess, reflecting of everyday life in the Soviet times in many places. Now this is also criticizing constructions. That's critique of bureaucracy. This was very much official. We see very similar themes in Crocodile as well, and other Soviet humor and satire journals. Well, sexual themes were not supposed to be there, but as Jonas Varnas, one of the artists, told me, who drew cartoons for the Broom, he said, well, but that was not an issue. We made women dressed up in clothing climb into the bed, and this was even more funnier. So they did not necessarily conceive those boundaries and restrictions as, to some extent, problematic. While in the majority of artists in the Broom were men, so I guess some topics like alcoholism or fishing or these would be part of their own culture. So this was the official broom of propaganda, trying to change society through those more official values, more political values like anti-imperialist cartoons, but also through everyday life. But the most intriguing part of the Broom for me was the covert sphere. I'm sorry, and this is the term that I came up with to explain what I discovered in the Broom. So instead of talking and using different language, socialist, nationalist, or socialist, post-socialist, or some other, or trying to uncover Soviet or Bolshevik subjectivity, I decided to come up with different analytics to explain what I saw there. So the covert sphere, and the term originally comes from Tim Melly, who used it to explain U.S. National security state, although I use it in a very different sense. But I preserved the covert and public sphere dichotomy. So the covert sphere, it's the sphere that was concealed from the public and authority. So it's important distinction that it couldn't be public. It couldn't be something that was shared with the readers, for example, and with everyone out there. But also it could not be shared with officially with some, well, it was shared with some people, but not with other authorities, for example, KGB officials. So it's concealed from the public and authorities, editorial staff engagements, and aesthetic deliberations. And I see two types of secrecies, institutional secrecy that I will talk about, and aesthetic secrecy. And aesthetic secrecy was part of institutional secrecy of the Broom. So first, institutional secrecy. 1972. Well, okay, let me shortly say a few general points. So the secrecy was part of the Broom as cultural and propaganda institution. It was blooming in the Broom headquarters and beyond. So explicit anti-Soviet submissions from readers were hid in a drawer or discarded. Some artists themselves tried to get some covert not anti-Soviet, but covert art published. Some of it was anti-Soviet. Even Broom communists lied about their work and frequency of their meetings to the regional Communist Party and Central Committee. Broom's editorial staff everyday life was marked by drinking, which they could comfortably enjoy in a restaurant in search for new aesthetic ideas, as they told me. Now, of course, these secrecies constitute various hierarchies and these circles are intended, it's kind of for my own purposes, to imagine those secrecies graphically. So of course the closest circle was the circle of artists, writers, and those who were the lower level of the Communist Party journal. And then, you know, the higher level was Broom editor-in-chief, the associate editor, and the executive secretary. And then there were censors, regional Communist parties, cadres, and so on and so on. So laughing and sharing secrets created political intimacies, forms of coexistence and togetherness. There were some heavy secrets, secrets that could be of interest to the KGB. And there were some other secrets that could be described or were greeted with knowing smiles. So that's Ledeneva's term. Like everyone knew that artists like to celebrate whatever they celebrated, and they liked to drink sometimes at work, or oftentimes I cannot tell exactly, but drinking is very prominent in all interviews and in the party documents as well. So let me give an example of institutional secrecy that is actually here, and this is 1972. The Brooms Workers' Pledge in honor of the celebration of the October Socialist Revolution. So this was a proclamation that one of the Broom artists found in his drawer. So he read it, and it's a mocking the October Revolution. All those, I'm not going to go over those 3 points. They are in Lithuanian here, but he went to the editor-in-chief and said there is an underground organization in the Broom after finding this proclamation. Well, everything seems kind of as it's supposed to be, right? They call in the KGB. KGB comes in and they look at everything, talk to others, and they say, there is nothing dangerous, there is nothing political, just in bad humor. So this was something that was kind of strange to me the first time I read. How would the KGB find this as just nothing political, only bad humor? Of course, it's political. But when the KGB left, the proclamation was almost forgotten. The cohesiveness of the Broom collective quivered. Vytautas, the person who found this proclamation, in the party documents is accused of political blackmail, which is another kind of counterintuitive step that they made. It was an open secret among the Broom artists that you can joke about communist holidays. This secret was partly shared by the Broom communists as well. Why else would they think of Vytautas' action as political blackmail? These secrets were not supposed to leave the Broom headquarters. They united the Broom staff in common laughter. For Vytautas, the artist who found this proclamation, was not funny. First, because it expressed already existing disagreements, but also because they laughed at him. Of course, he was the butt of their laughter. He most likely wanted to punish them by calling in the KGB and exposing them to danger. And I think, you know, the fact that the KGB found this as bad humor illustrates some kind of complicity of them in common laughter, in those common secrecies. So maybe this was also part of political intimacy that they shared, because I can provide a lot of examples where they share that political intimacy and those secrecies with censors. Now, when I conducted interviews in 2000s, and a couple of artists told me that how they understand Vytautas' actions. They said, why did he do it? It must have been something wrong with him. Nobody felt that there was something wrong with mocking the October Revolution, which I found particularly interesting. So the ethos of the covert sphere is very different from Habermasian public sphere, which is defined by free assemblage, communication, and accessible information. And of course, it's different from Soviet public sphere, which is not defined by free, as we imagine free assemblage, communication, and accessible information was constrained. The covert sphere, it's defined, as I already mentioned, by political intimacy and trust, circulation of concealed information defined by rigid boundaries of familiarity, hierarchy, and prestige. And to give you just another example, from their celebratory culture. So, for example, they used to drink and celebrate their achievements in the attic, while the editor-in-chief used to sit on the second floor, I think on the second or one level lower, just in case someone comes. So the editor-in-chief, as artists remembered, never drank with them together. So he had a different status. He was a member of a different bubble. So that's basically what I'll be talking about. That's the bubble. So these bubbles disappear. But at the same time, he was again complicit in the covert sphere. He was protecting his collective from evil eye, whether these would be readers or some others. And I tried again, and not everything was shared, but of course, that the closest circle, as I told you, was between artists, writers, some journalists, and some secrets were known by the editor-in-chief. But the editor-in-chief function was also to make sure those secrets do not pass the editorial headquarters, do not reach the public. He was the first censor, and then there were other censors. And interestingly, if we think about censorship, so when I look through censorship archives, there are some comments, and you don't know whether this is something that they just wrote to justify that sometimes they fail, or whether this was sincere admission. But they said that we need better censors, we need better intellectuals, because we cannot catch those secrets. We are not capable of getting all of them. So this was a glove-lit concern, but at the same time, you have examples from interviews when they say, okay, we had an exhibition, we all were here together, and I would censor, and this is Jonas Varna's memory as well, used to go over the exhibition, and he used to say, okay, take this away, because Moscow will not like it. So again, there is that complicity, or should we call it secrecy? Maybe this is already something else, but I would define that this is part of the covert sphere that I am talking about. Now, let's turn to the aesthetic secrecy, which was part of the institutional secrecy. And this is, I guess, something that is most exciting. And now I have a task to uncover those secrets in art, and it's not that easy. Well, some artists already told me don't even try. But anyway, I'll talk shortly in the time that is left for me about style, silence, and the Aesopian language. And first, style. So I read all, those communist imperatives, what communist art is supposed to be, and these were imperatives that were also part of the Broom communist agenda. So especially in 60s, in 70s and 80s, especially in 80s already, they give up. But in 60s, it's very prominent. They ask for clear art language, a language that could be understandable to the working class people, for simplicity. They ask for art that would be in socialist, realist form rather than modernist, as they call it. And also they disprove any kind of intellectualism, individualism, which was not the communist language of art that they were trying to develop. So style. Well, in 60s, Broom Broom has new artists as part of their editorial staff who are young, who come with new ideas, and they try to experiment. They try to develop their own style. And Andrius Cvirka, also Kęstutis Šiaulietis, admitted to me that they tried to come up with their own signature art. And this is something that we usually think of if we think about art. And artists, they usually have their own kind of signature. And of course, they were inspired by Western art and all kind of different cartoons and art that they were familiar with. So they tried to come up with their own style, and that style changed from time to time. So here you see Andrius Cvirka cartoon. It was something that was not liked by the editor-in-chief and the executive secretary. So according to the executive secretary, Sadaunykas, artists in 1940, 1941 created realistic and simple cartoons that were understandable to every reader. He condemned other styles as technically inept. All our art has developed in a realistic direction until now. We cannot draw open snouts, people squares, or monsters, and some of Cvirka's drawings kind of really fit that monster, I think, description. Drawing this way shows that you are trying to hide your inability to draw well. So unfinished lines, unfinished figures, something like that was something that was disproved and not acceptable. Now to illustrate how style can be important in communicating certain or hiding certain messages. Well, style was a secret on its own because they were mimicking Western styles as well. But at the same time, it was a means to hide certain secrets. And just another example very quickly, Jonas Varna started to use a knot on his own cartoon. It's like, you have a frame and there is a little knot tying that frame. And everyone were concerned, what is this? What it's supposed to mean? Is this anti-Soviet or not? But that ambiguity is something that they couldn't stand and couldn't accept. So it took him quite a while to get this through. He wanted it just as his signature. But this is another example. It's not directly from the Broom, but it was told by the contributing artist, Vladimiras Beresniovas. So this is a page from one catalog. And what happened, so they used to receive those catalogs, artists, from the West, and this is from Berlin, exhibition in Berlin. But what happened, censors somehow missed that there was a cartoon with Brezhnev. And catalog reached artists. So what do you do? So the KGB knocked on his door. That's his story that he told me. Knocked on his door and asked to rip the page with Brezhnev off the catalog. That's what he did. But there was another page. And those who are not familiar with the great leader of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Ilyich Brezhnev, here he is. There was another cartoon that you see here, because the ripped page disappeared, although Beresnova said I didn't throw it away, but he couldn't find it. So there was another cartoon that they missed. And this is about the concern, how well you can catch those meanings. So sometimes you get concerned about not, maybe it means something, but in other cases, you have Brezhnev as some kind of primate depicted here, and it's about style. If the style is more open-ended, if you don't draw those realistic figures, you can communicate all kind of different things. And just imagine what happened, and I didn't ask him, but I imagine, they laughed at the KGB, they laughed at censors because that they didn't notice that, and they still had a good laugh of Brezhnev. So by making this important, they really kind of stimulated more laughter than it would originally have been there. And another example, this actually went through the KGB headquarters. So this was published, that's a back cover of the broom. And someone identified the guy up there as Brezhnev. And those who don't know, you cannot draw Muhammad, you cannot draw Brezhnev too. So those who don't know about the Soviet regulations, because you cannot mock your leader, you cannot laugh at your leader, and some other authorities too. So, and you can argue whether it's Brezhnev or not, but no, I don't think so. But the argument was, that, okay, those capitalists, they are usually skinny, they look nice, and the plump figure must be Brezhnev. So this went back to the KGB with readers' note, this is KGB. Well, so readers not only laughed at the cartoons, but they also, there were some who took care and, were very vigilant to make sure that this doesn't pollute the public sphere. And Kęstutis Šiaulytis, who was the author of this cartoon, was invited to the KGB and had to explain himself. Again, you see markings of dollars to make sure this is the capitalist West. It's not the Soviet Union. Now, and it's again about the style. How do you draw those figures? Now, silence. It's also part of the covert sphere, of the aesthetic covert sphere. So they were expected to draw anti-nationalist and anti-religious cartoons. And what happened, there were very little cartoons, that kind of cartoons in the journal. And in the party documents, they speak explicitly, all those 20 years, we need more anti-religious cartoons, we need more anti-nationalist cartoons. Then you start wondering, were they not able to enforce this? We need, and it got a little bit better, but then again, there are so little, those anti-religious cartoons. So they increased honoraria for those cartoons, and they were able to publish some of them. And here is one of those cartoons. At the same time, you doubt whether they really want to increase the number of those cartoons, but you can see also their reluctance in that kind of quotes like, but we do not have to offend religious peoples and feelings of the people, so we don't criticize people. Be very careful. So that's what it is criticized. It's not religion, it's not believers, but it's the priest. And Algirdas Radvilavičius, who is the author of this cartoon, he used to draw those cartoons, and he said he was not even a professional artist, so that was an easy way for him to get published. To be published in this journal was a matter of honor. It was very prestigious. It was something that was very important. I don't know even what to compare to, but he said, again, he just confirmed that I criticized priests. I didn't criticize the religion itself, and it's kind of material evidence to that. I have this photo with him in his room a couple years ago. And he said that this cross was there in Soviet times as well. So you can see, that it's not so easy as we would expect. It's for religion or against religion. The situation is much more complex. And Azopian language. So that's where, since I have to finish, right? Soon I'll mention a couple of aspects. That's where we can see those national sentiments coming in. So instead of reading, for example, these cartoons as critique in general of pollution, very often it looks like from readers' memories and artists' recollections, they were read as a critique of the Soviet system. So the Soviet other is polluting our land, our Lithuanian land. And another Azopian technique is the use of those symbols. So everywhere in Crocodile and in the broom you could see US. And in 1990, Kęstutis Šiaulytis translated what they meant by US when they wrote it. Of course, the readers do not necessarily knew this. This might have been an inside secret. And towards conclusion. So it would be tempting to conclude, of course, this was the Soviet Western frontier, that there were some kind of nationalist humor emerging, but I think things are much more complicated. So I would like to conclude with a couple of points. So the Broom, of course, played a very important role in shaping official and public sphere. It was a very popular journal, one issue per 30 people. And at its peak in 1980s, it was 200,000 copies in Lithuania, which is 3 million people. And it was the journal that paid for itself, unlike the communist Truth or Komsomol Truth or the Truth that was subsidized by the state. And the Communist Party journal was the official publisher of it, of course. So we see those modernist rearticulations of Soviet artistic idioms. We see social and national critique of the USSR. And in regard to those national sentiments, I would like to kind of conclude speaking about competing sovereignties rather than, a clear nationalist space emerging. So whether this is a colonial project or imperial project, we always have those competing sovereignties. And this is what emerged in the Broom, so alternative regimes of authority and recognition. And I guess I will leave it there. There's a last conclusion, but it would take me another 3 minutes, so I can go? All right, so my last conclusion is about Soviet freedom. So when I talk to artists, they often remember kind of Soviet not Soviet, but they say freedom that we had then. Many of them stopped drawing in post-Soviet times. Many of them feel less free than before. So how do we explain this kind of sentiment? And if we look at the Broom through the covert and public sphere dichotomy, I think we can conclude that secrecy gave a feeling of freedom in Soviet times. So they were special. They were empowered to create these secrets. Moreover, they were in general in control of them themselves through censorship and collaboration with authorities. So secrecy gave a feeling of group solidarity and cohesion, which seemed to have gone together with secrets and jokes in post-Soviet times. Secrecy mediated various uncertainties of the socialist world, controlling and mastering an ambiguous Soviet condition of being Soviet, socialist and nationalist, colonizer and colonized, communist and dissident. And many had a good laugh about it. Thank you.
I'm wondering if you think the KGB...
We're going to use the mic so everyone can
Yeah.
hear.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I think this whole business of the different circles of secrecy and maybe interchange between them is a really interesting model. So, for example, in the case of the situation where the KGB looks at that satire on the celebration of the October Revolution and say, this is nothing, just bad humor. Do you think that each circle, in a sense, has a kind of dialogue with the one above over what's going to be acceptable? Inasmuch as we know that when the communist system collapsed, it collapsed surprisingly quickly.
Yeah.
And those people in the KGB had no problem going over and working for the security services of a capitalist regime. So they really probably appreciated the ridiculousness of some of the Soviet rituals, and they thought it was funny themselves. So in a way, it's a kind of exchange of ideas between the different levels, And there's a kind of testing always as to what will be tolerated. So I'm wondering if you think that was going on. Another thing that occurred to me is maybe it was in the interest of the KGB not to crack down on cartoonists or writers who do something that's obviously dissident, just to hold it in their files, perhaps compromise that person and force them to be informer at a later date or something like that. I don't, you don't.
I can
Somebody
take
else.
it's Donna's property. Well, yes, that's a great point. And I wish I could find more materials about that. So I rely on the Communist Party archives, on the Broom internal Communist Party organization archives, also letters that readers sent to them. And there are also big art and literature archives where they have Broom, all kind of materials as well. But my research, and that's what I'm going to do in the summer, it's looking for a needle in a big hay
Well, I think
carriage.
the fact that it is covert makes it very hard to find.
It is
It's
hard.
all covert, it means that nobody's going to be, or rarely is someone going to leave an explicit trace of their
Right.
sympathy with the dissident
Exactly.
sentiment, or of the fact that they are, holding it for purposes of blackmail.
So, yes, and in the KGB archives, I couldn't find anything explicit about the Broom, but they don't have it cataloged, So they told me to look there and over there, So I have some information, but nothing explicit. But I think, what was important, it was that they were loyal to the regime. Loyalty was important very much. So Andris Cvirka, who tried to experiment and push those boundaries all the time, he admitted, I tried to push those boundaries all the time. I tried to sneak something in. And he got in trouble quite a bit for that. But others said it's not worth to irritate the editor, Anyway, this is not going to go through. But some did try. And Cvirka himself was, as he told me when I asked him, how did you get a job at the Broom? Because all of them were handpicked. He said, I was a kid of a monument. And that was such a nice phrase. So his father, there was a monument for him in Vilnius. It still is. He was a famous writer, but also was...
He's the son of Cvirka.
He is the son of Cvirka, of the one who went to Moscow to ask Lithuania to be incorporated into the Soviet Union. So he was immune, in a sense, in that respect. What do you do if you start questioning that Cvirka's son? And it's you raised many important points. You kind of see those ties. You see that there was communication going on. There was that complicity, and I can diagnose it because I see it, but I cannot tell abundant stories about it because of the lack of evidence. And definitely, yes, it leads, and that's why I say it's alternative kind of regime of authority emerging in late socialism. Or Lithuania maybe has never disappeared, because it was just incorporated in 1940. There was a big resistance movement until Stalin's death, and then we had all the deportees and others returning. So it just shows the complexity of relations that were there. So you cannot simply conclude, and they lead to the nationalist movement. But the nationalist movement itself is a very complex event. You cannot just conclude about it from one example. Yes, thank you very much for your comment.
Following up on Herb's question and your answer just now, and I'm hoping not to impose my impression of social worlds of intellectuals in Russia, but so I'm asking, right? So your interlocking circles, I think, give a really nice picture of divisions of labor, right, at work. So what would it look like if you took all the same individual points within the circles, the people, and make also, say, a transparent kin chart of them, and then also make like a chart of all the people who went to school with each other, and then maybe the neighborhoods, right, and get the different levels of social connection, and then superimpose it over the circles, and you'd see all these other connections and crisscrossings that kind of make those circles porous in other venues. And then I wonder how that might help us think about the connections in terms besides just complicity, but in other forms of connection.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's an important point. So I see, for me, loyalty and trust is an important element of that. And whether this goes through kinship or through other venues, all of them, as I mentioned, were handpicked. All of them were reliable. And this was one of the questions that I had when I did research on late socialism. How come, that those loyal people were able to say much more? They were able to say they were at the front of the nationalist movement, basically, because they were trusted. Even in Soviet times, they could say Lithuania, whatever, and speak about all kind of historical and national themes, and was considered to be okay. So in this sense, it's not so much about ideology, it's about loyalty and who you are. And yes, kinship was important. They were kids, the young artists, they were kids of the elites. And I don't know who the KGB or censors were, but Bulota himself, who was the editor-in-chief, he was the oldest. For all these years, he was defined as slick as a fox, which is a very kind of Soviet, very common characteristic. You had to know how to navigate those corridors, so it's personal attribute in addition to kinship ties and other things. But he was, as far as I know, he was a partisan that fought for Soviet cause during World War II. So this was an important legacy that he brought with him. And it's just interesting, it comes up, he never ever mentions that, and it comes up in 70s. And in one document, it was just shortly mentioned because he applied for a certain award. And I said, how come, how come he never built on this kind of identity and used it? And probably he did not want to emphasize that kind of identity. There were some other things that were important, and even if you were a Soviet partisan, there was that other side, nationalist, Lithuanian, whatever, that blended into all of this. Thank you. Yes, I will do that.
And just to follow up,
Genealogy is
I
plugged in
can
into
I
the
add
circle.
One more thing that I've noticed.
Wait a second.
So I just wanted to add a comment to that, but over the course of my fieldwork with Roma, I realized that they told very different jokes than did the people who we see as the dissidents. And so it was the dissidents who told all the sort of anti-government jokes, but they were the elites. But if you're actually marginalized, it's a different kind of humor that matters to you. So what we see is against the system seems like it's actually folded in with it more than other vectors of social roles. Anyway.
Yeah, that's right. That's important. Thanks.
Thank you. Obviously, an excellent talk. This might be a little out there, but I was wondering if you saw any examples of how these comics dealt with what we would perhaps think in the West of Soviet aggression. I'm thinking specifically Afghanistan, but sort of if you ran across any representations of how they saw Soviet military acts abroad.
Well, that's a great question. So officially, you could not publish anything. Everything has to be labeled. There was aggression, but it was always U.S. or Western aggression, officially. Now, I don't know. I don't know how they saw Soviet aggression. I imagine there must have been a lot of critique, whether specifically of the war in Afghanistan or something else. People remember even nowadays how you were taken to Afghanistan without any kind of warning, and some returned in those metal coffins back. So this was part of the public sphere, how artists reacted as artists to it. I'm not sure. Thank you. I'll ask the question. That's a very interesting point. it's interesting to read through those censorship documents, what you're not supposed to mention. And well, the war in Afghanistan was one of those, of course. And there are layers of layers because everything is connected to Soviet military complex and all kind of things, economic, geopolitical, even the weather, was something that was like, if you write somewhere, there are no good things that come from the East, or if you say that when you announce about the weather, this is wrong, So it's interesting how they try to catch all kind of ambiguities that could be produced, and even the weather was supposed to be narrated in a certain way. Mm-hmm.
Wait, just a second. We need to use the mic because we can't hear you.
I said that you find this journal in your country. Did you find anything like that in Soviet itself?
In Soviet?
Yeah, in Russia itself. Do they have the same kind of critique, kind of laughter?
Oh, I didn't go. Well, what I know, I didn't go to Russia yet. I am planning to go. I just heard that there are no, from historians, I know that there are no archives, like Gleblit archives, the Central Censorship Bureau archives are completely destroyed. That's what they told me. But it would be very interesting to compare to Crocodile. So whatever comparisons I make, they're not based on archival research, they are based on other studies of Crocodile, for example.
Can you explain what Crocodile is?
Crocodile was Russian Soviet humor and satire journal. So it was like a standard that all those republics were supposed to follow, whether that's Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia. So it was, and it was the elite journal, the best basically journal. Although what's the best again, is argued about. Lithuanian artists would say that Piker Estonian journal was the best humor and satire journal because it was the most modern. It was the most departing from socialist realism. While Crocodile, in general, there is that anticipation that. And that conclusion that it still relied very much on socialist realist imperatives. And you see differences in style and aesthetics when you look at Crocodile as well. And there are artists like Yefimov who started to draw very early. So he actually was the official artist of Crocodile for 100 years. He died. He was over 100. So, there is a different legacy, and it's basically older artists who were part of the Crocodile editorial staff, not the young, like in the room. But yes, this is something on to-do list.
You didn't have much better paper, though, as I remember.
Didn't?
The paper is very similar.
Mm.
Yeah. Hi. First of all, thank you for a wonderful talk.
Oh, thanks.
I was just wondering, sort of along the same lines of Andy's question, I noticed in one of the issues there was some talk about Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and I can't read Lithuanian, so I couldn't really grasp the gist of the cartoons, but I was wondering how the revolutions in both of these countries were covered at the time, considering Lithuania was on the edge of the Soviet Union, and if there would be any fear of, I guess, revolutions of that type taking place in more of the border areas, and how the coverage was balanced between showing the events and trying to make sure that it didn't influence others.
Yep, that's a great question, and I don't know the answer too, because I end up with Gorbachev, because when Gorbachev, who was the leader who initiated perestroika and glasnost, so political and economic reforms in the Soviet Union, he made things much more difficult. So what we see from 1985, a very different kind of humor and satire emerge, much more open, and I didn't look at these issues with this kind of question because I'm trying. It's already a lot of material. how they are covered. You know, speaking in general about Lithuania, they were very, because this was of course censored, this was controlled, so they were very, very careful. And if you look, well, I wrote another article about deportations and justice regimes and suffering. So when they started actually to articulate the nationalist sentiments in a more explicit way. So this does not come up until 1988. Basically, although in 1987 we have the most radical group have a meeting at the monument of Adam Mickiewicz in Vilnius, where they got on August 23rd to commemorate Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, and over there they already were speaking about national Lithuania's independence. But officially and publicly, you know, it's not until '88. And the first time when you see those issues emerge, they are the critique of the Stalinist regime and injustice and deportations that took place in Lithuania, and they come from the elites. So that's the connection to the Broom. I would imagine the Broom experimented along these lines too. I would be not surprised to find this pattern and the kind of similar timeline, because they were very much following who is saying what, how much I can say already. And in 1988, June 3rd, SAJUDIS, the movement for restructuring of Lithuania, is created, which becomes the major pro-independence force. So that's kind of the timeline which I believe was followed. In the beginning, just being very careful whether that's ecology or some other topics that you could safely bring about in order to raise those concerns about what's going on and critique. And later on, you know, kind of getting more and more into nationalist repertoire, meaning pro-independence, sovereignty of Lithuania, independent from the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm.
Well, I wonder how these artists were paid.
Thank you, Donna. Were they salaried or whether they commissioned? Well, how did it work?
That's important. Yes, so they got their salaries, but they also got honoraria for whatever they published. So if you publish the cover, you get more.
How much?
Oh, well, yes, that's a good question.
Whether
I can tell you how much they put together in one head what they used to go to drink and celebrate. 230 rubles just for the first round. And they called, if you want to know about their status in monetary value, and they used, I know, that's what I'm telling you, you know. So it was, you know, it was pretty good. And this is, again, this is the memory of Rimša, published in Alytaus Naujienos. So they used to come, those contributors and artists and editors, they used to talk about common issues, and then they used to go and celebrate. So they called a restaurant, they said, we are coming, and there was a table, of course, for them immediately ready, even if they were reserved before. And you know, he tells in that paper that it was 230 in 70s, which is a lot, right? And then, you know, if you want more, so you, and it tells also about, you know, kind of circulation. Well, the salary, my mother was, I'm original Lithuanian, so my mother was a doctor, and she used to get, I think, 120, right? Would that be?
That's probably an
70s,
entry level, a
yeah.
very early level, probably. Well, lady must have been a bit.
Yeah, probably
more,
maybe more. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know exact numbers, but you were paid well, you know. Somehow in my mind it's like the cover $40, but I'm not 40 rubles, but I'm not that sure what I remember. I have to ask again. And it was, they were encouraged to have others publish in the room, not just their own cartoons. So what they did, they changed the name. So you see Kęstutis Šiaulytis, and then I showed you some Cvirka's cartoons. So there, in some cases, there is Andrius Cvirka, and then there is Aloyzas Krizas, which was another secret, you know, on its own. So they got more money, of course, and they kind of tried to keep this
I noticed that
for
on two of
themselves.
the cartoons.
Yes.
Where you had the artist in the corner, it
Yeah.
wasn't signed
And
by the artist.
I even mixed it up myself once in one of my articles. Who was who? You know, said Kęstutis Šiaulytis, who was Cvirka. Yes, that was secret names, kind of. Well, they knew these names all among themselves.
Laba diena. Ačiū labai. In your 1972 issue here, there's one drawing that is also by Cvirka, and I don't know the figures enough to interpret. I wonder what is your interpretation, because it says Michigan across the bottom of a tree.
Oh, right. Yes. So you have to read the article.
And my reading skills aren't good enough.
Yeah. I don't remember what that specific article was all about. But Cvirka himself, can I step out because you know the camera will not see? We have surveillance camera. Cvirka was in Chicago, and that's another very interesting question. He traveled to Mexico too, so just showing, you know, letting them travel, and they were mobile, unlike many other citizens. Of course, they had to go through approval and so on, but Cvirka, especially Cvirka, I've seen party documents where they sanction his visits to Chicago, or I think it was Mexico. I have to ask him again. And others also traveled, but not so far away. You know, they were predominantly socialist Eastern Europe and some Western countries. So maybe that was related to his trip.
So thank you again. I find your description of the kind of the editor-in-chief really sort of familiar. You see this model in a lot of different kind of places.
Mm-hmm.
You know, mostly just familiar with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering if you could speculate a little bit on where this standardization came from. Did all editors have to go through some kind of central education thing? Was this more a feature of kind of the work they had to do between these two different levels? Kind of horizontal staff who are working within some operation, and then sort of like party supervision somehow? I mean, just because it's really striking how similar this is to a lot of different things in Russia.
Right. Yes, so there were all kind of regulations, published regulations, of course, that they had to follow. But like in case of censorship as well, you know, you have published regulations, but you have like a word of mouth. You know what you are not supposed to do. So this was the case as well. And the way it functioned, you know, you get those regulations from the regional Communist Party headquarters, you know, and what are the imperatives? What you have to do? You have to collaborate with, for example, Interior Ministry to make sure, you know, alcoholism decreases in Soviet Lithuania, things like that. And then, you know what, if I go to Interior Ministry archives, I see publications of Šluota, and they are so proud. They provided materials to Šluota to publish there. So there was a kind of a complex institutional collaboration as well. But I believe, you know, this was also unwritten, that if there is a major holiday, you have to publish about the major holiday. If there is a major event, like, you know, the Communist Party Congress, you have to address those issues, and you do that. I don't have enough knowledge to, you know, to say whether there was something, of course, in the regulations that you have to do that. But there were all kind of imperatives that were interpreted. And there was that mimicry, you know, it's like if we think about Russia or the Soviet Union, the center, what was produced there, it was mimicked in Lithuania. So there was always that symbiotic relationship. And at the same time, we know about mimicry, right? It's never perfectly, never a perfect copy of the original.
Who's next?
Yeah, go ahead. And then,
Going back to a question about salaries, and if there is any kind of like punishment if they tried to produce something or publish something that was bunker, that was not approved, were they punished by salary
Yeah.
as well? That was the way of.
Well, yes, and there were all kind of ways to punish. So if you end up, for example, after one celebration in that, how is it called, Trezvilka in English? How is it? Anyone knows? Well, it's a special institution where you get drunk people, keep them overnight, and then in the morning. Yeah, I have to find out what's the English translation for that. Those who speak Russian, if you mention Trezvilka, immediately will know and will we'll laugh already about it. So that's where they ended up sometimes. And of course, there is at least one story. It's just unbelievable. I read that in the Communist Party. Broom's Communist Party reports that how the executive secretary, which was a communist official in the Broom, justified why he was taken to Trezvilka. He said, I had some drinks and then I went home, I knocked on the door. It's like in that Russian comedy, Posle Bani, after, yes. And familiar woman opened the door, and she called the police, and he was blaming her for doing that. So after these kind of events, you of course, officially have to issue some kind of reprimand, or you will say, your salary will go down, or something. There were all kind of ways to address those issues. They tried to hide that as much as they could, and there were some funny stories. When I talk to artists and I tell what I found them about Trezvilka, they say, "Oh, I'm glad this was not the one about me," and so apparently this was not very rare cases of events. But there were some cases when they even, for example, were considered, that they have to quit working in the Broom because, and there were some, in recollections of the artists that some had to leave the Broom because they just didn't know the limit. They couldn't work. Life was difficult. It was looked at all these things in the context as those who study the region, they know in the context of broader social relations. So, for example, I'm always very unhappy to see that they blame wives for drinking, or that they are unhappy, that their wives are not in one way or the other good enough. They don't understand them, So it's not that the person is guilty himself, it's not his agency, but there are some kind of outside circumstances that they try to justify why this happened. Overall, yeah.
Just the very idea of you being put into this drunk trap is that, like, then when you get sober, you get back to the right idea, or to misunderstand.
Yeah. Well, in general, I don't know. You asked about cartoons, what would happen, if something gets through. So in general, there was that kind of, it seems to me, mutual agreement, that we don't get kind of contradictory cartoons out. So even if we talk about those secrecies, these are minor things overall, right? There is not that they tried to sneak in Brezhnev, there was one that was considered Brezhnev, but even you think it's not Brezhnev. So you can see, it's not big secrets that they tried. There was one that Zvirka got in trouble for. There was Lenin's 100th anniversary, 1970. So there was Lenin 100. I'm still waiting to get this from Zvirka. He said he has this issue somewhere. So it was Lenin 100, and then I didn't see it, so I just telling what they told me, and then it ends up 001. The way that 100 kind of goes in circles, and it ends 001. And they already published the issue itself. It was ready to go to the kiosks and stores, and they caught it. And that was a big deal because they had to destroy the issue. So he has a few issues left, but basically all issue was, so this was something that all of them remember. It was a big deal. It was a big deal in the Broom as an institution itself. So all kind of these things affected all of them. It's not that, we think about one individual. And they pretty much thought about all of us. If I do this, all of us will suffer in one or the other way.
Thank you so much again for this talk. I have a question that's maybe not fair in some ways, because it's outside the scope of what you defined your talk as being about, but to carry it forward to some extent. So,
thank you.
So I'm really curious about two things, I guess. One, about the artists and writers that you've been interviewing, if you have some sense. So you mentioned that they didn't continue this work. And some of them didn't. And so I guess I'm curious, what did they do, if there's some patterns to that, if you have a sense of how you spoke to this to some extent, that they saw an era of freedom to some extent that was then lost in post-Soviet times. But if you could speak more to kind of how they saw their work in their sense of what their lives are about now, several decades after this, and then also about the covert public division that you're identifying. What happened to that afterwards? Is it evident in other ways? Is it a distinction that doesn't matter anymore when the Soviet Union isn't there?
Well, if there is the covert sphere in art, well, of course, the boundary between the covert and public sphere eroded during late 80s and later. Whether there is the covert sphere now, it's very different if there is one. What do artists speak about their own art? I'm trying to think in what context you are asking, what do you think they could think about it? But whether they think it was something wrong to publish those socialist cartoons or political cartoons?
No, I guess not so much whether they think it's right or wrong, but in terms of that was something that they did for a certain period of time, and then some of them have done other things with their lives afterwards. So how do they compare?
How they reconcile, right?
Yeah, how
and
do they see those
is
in the view of all of the other things that they have done
right.
in their
This
lives?
is some of those boundaries that we have when we think about the Soviet and post-Soviet era. And it was just amazing for me, to see that for some there is no that clear boundary, whether we look at art or some other things. They one of them, Kęstutis Šiaulietis, who has been one of my major informants. He has been the youngest artist, and he very much continued his work. He never stopped. He was the youngest artist hired by the Broom. But he said, I was interested in nature and collective farm when it was kind of my area at that time. And all these topics like agriculture, kolkhoz, collective farm issues, bad kolkhozniki, those collective farm workers, were the concern of the Soviet state. You had to make sure, you have to laugh at them, you have to improve the life over there. And it was something that was, again, part of their regulations. That you have to focus on these issues. So he kind of got in charge in Soviet times, and now he travels to those rural areas, and he draws portraits, he draws nature, he draws all kind of themes there, and he feels like, that was his niche, and he still continues. He has his own kind of he has his own blog and where he posts all kind of cartoons about what he discovers there, and paintings. He's also a painter. So there was no kind of a very abrupt change, and he at least seems to have supported the transition from the very beginning on. The cartoon that I showed to you with the U.S. Union Soviet was actually his cartoon, published in that period that you asked me about in 1990. Others, this continued. Like Jonas Varnas, he still publishes political cartoons in the main newspapers, very talented artists who were able to reinvent. And if we think about that critical discourse, the critique of the state, critique of politics, so whether this is socialist or post-socialist, you will always find all kind of issues, right, to laugh at. Andris Tvirka is the one who does not draw anymore, and I very much encouraged him to draw, and I'm just very much excited by his art. But in his opinion, and I don't know the full story, but he was criticized by some of the cartoons, anti-EU cartoons that he published. I'm not exactly sure which critique, was so strong that made him change his opinion that he's not going to draw anymore. But there are, again, different stories that we find in post-Soviet era. But there is kind of, like, despite those different stories, there is that overarching nostalgia for lost laughter. We even have one article that just came out by Natkarny and Lampland where they speak, where are all jokes gone? There is that feeling that jokes are gone from Hungary to Lithuania and Russia, I believe. The jokes have disappeared. Although whatever studies I get, the numbers, they did not disappear. They have changed, and it's just something that is not very visible.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you for wonderful questions. They made me think into different directions.